So this is obviously the worst case scenario for 2040, and unfortunately, it's kind of a likely scenario as well. But just in this scenario, you paint in 2040, China has become at least the regional hegemon. What can be done to overthrow the Chinese regime's grip on the Indo-Pacific in this scenario?
In 2040, you mean?
Yeah, and like this worst case scenario, 2040. Because I want to see like what would have to happen if we don't stop it now. What would it take in this scenario to stop it?
Game's over in 2040.
Nothing can be done.
At that point, it's going to be extremely difficult. You never say never, of course. You always want to be bright-eyed and optimistic and say, democracy and the good guys and gals will overcome. But in reality, because what is happening to the Uyghurs, that genocide that is widely recognized now, finally, we're using the right terminology. It's widely recognized as genocide. That's the fate of the people of Taiwan, because once Taiwan gives in, and then in this case, they just succumb to the political warfare pressure. It's not necessarily an invasion that causes or that allows Beijing to annex Taiwan. Once that happens and the first PLA forces set foot on Taiwan, then you start the internment camps, what we call concentration camps. Then you start the reprisals, the retribution, and all those things will be done behind closed doors because no news media organization is going to be in there. It's going to be almost impossible to know what's going on there because of the Great Wall that China will set up around there. Cyber, media, online media, nothing will penetrate what's going on there, and that will be the case elsewhere. It'll be very difficult to regain our footing and to push back. Can't say it never would happen. Look what happened. Look how the world looked on the morning of December 8th, 1941. We looked out on Pearl Harbor. I live right next to Pearl Harbor, and I can look out where the Arizona is, and I can look out where the Missouri is birthed. And you know that what you saw on the morning of December 8th, 1941 was smoking hulks of ships and fire still coming from a number of them, and the U.S. Pacific Fleet, by and large, laying on the bottom of Pearl Harbor. And in Europe, the situation is absolutely horrible. Country after country has fallen to the Nazis. So we've had bleak prospects in the past. It wasn't but a little more than 4 years later that the Allies, led by the Americans, were sailing triumphantly into Tokyo Bay, and we had already taken Berlin, and then the Nazi regime had fallen, but there was hell to pay to get there. And that would be a lot more hell to pay to push the totalitarian, fascist, brutally repressive Chinese regime back after we've fallen back as far as I project we will by 2040.
So is this inevitable?
No, of course not. This is a wake-up call. This is an opportunity to get out of our tunnel vision. This paper is the chance to get out of our day-to-day diplomatic requirements. If you're in State Department, our day-to-day fulfill the administrative minutia, the administrivias, we used to call it in DOD, that you're dealing with every day, Department of Commerce, Department of Education, and then American civil society and Japanese civil society and government. Get out of that routine, that rut, and start looking at what the future looks like if we don't better recognize, better detect, better deter, better confront, better learn how to defeat Chinese political warfare. We can change that dystopian future. We can keep it on a fairly level keel.
One thing that I found kind of surprising when you published this paper is the idea that Japan is so vulnerable, because I think a lot of people think of Japan, as one of the stronger nations in the Indo-Pacific when it comes to being resilient against the Chinese Communist Party. And partly because the CCP has always kind of treated Japan as an enemy. So it would seem that their political warfare tactics wouldn't be as easily accepted there as in, for example, South Korea or some other countries that we've seen. But you're saying that it is actually quite vulnerable, right?
It is vulnerable. China and Japan go back in their relationship because of propinquity. They're right next to each other. And so their relationship in conflict, in wars and invasion, it goes back 2,000 years. And so, yes, there's a certain acceptance of certain cultural influence on Japan, which is accepted and appreciated. But there's also an understanding that that China has a very malign attitude in many cases against Japan and the Japanese people. Fairly recent Pew poll shows that about 85% of the Japanese people don't very much like and certainly don't trust China. So the Japanese people are, I think, quite wise in this regard, but that doesn't mean that they fully appreciate and understand the scope of political warfare. And how it works out. It's a very much a combined arms warfare approach that China takes against every country, the United States, Japan, all our friends and allies, and the means that they use with their massive organization, very powerfully resourced political warfare apparatus, and the top level direction by Xi Jinping himself. His dad was a political warfare officer. He understands how the United Front system works and how valuable it is. You can win everything you want through political warfare. The Japanese people, like the American people, know and understand some of China's malign influence. They don't have a good appreciation of just the breadth and scope, the depth of what comprises political warfare, of the war being fought against them on a daily basis. Japanese people don't, American people don't. Japanese elected officials don't. A lot of policymakers don't. Same thing in America. So we're running in parallel vulnerabilities in this regard. That's why education about political warfare, what you're doing in China Uncensored, China Unscripted, is so important because you help educate about the insidious, malign nature of China's political warfare.
So, big picture, I guess what we need to understand is what should the U.S. and Japan do to prevent this 2040 scenario you've described? And how is the Chinese Communist Party using political warfare to prevent that from happening?
Okay, well, let's take your second question first. Let's look at what they're doing, and then we can discuss some of the steps that the U.S. and Japan. I'm glad you put it that way because we need and Japan needs us. Alone, goes back to a Revolutionary War concept. We can all hang together. We can hang separately. Better that we stick together. We're a lot stronger. So let's parse out for a little while what exactly the political warfare operations are being conducted by China against Japan, because that's an essential part of it. A lot of our diplomats and general and flag officers, naval officers, admirals, and general officers in the Army, Marine Corps, and Air Force that I've met don't really understand political warfare. DoD officials don't understand what it is. So let's parse out some of what's going on against Japan, because if you don't know that you're under attack, you're not going to fight back effectively. By the time you find out exactly what they did to you, you're in a POW camp. Okay, and that's if you're lucky. If you were one of the ones who lived, then you're in a POW camp, or you're basically a vassal state again, as I've described many of the countries in Southeast Asia. So let's look at first military intimidation. What it is that China's doing against Japan is massive. The using not just the PLA, People's Liberation Army, and their incursions and circumnavigation around Japan of attack air groups and of naval surface groups and of ballistic missile submarines, but also the use of the maritime militia, those gray zone Very difficult to combat because we haven't come up with a good strategies, good policies to combat that. The gray zone operations is where they win. They never have to go to the conventional warfare. They never have to use all those weapons that they built, those amphibious assault ships, those destroyers, those cruisers that they've been building at a massive scale, where they're going to be double the size of the U.S. Navy. The PLA Navy will be double the size of the U.S. Navy in about now a little less than 9 years.
Real quick, for those listening, can you give a brief explanation of gray zone warfare, just so they know what you mean?
Sure. It's where the militia comes up and edges out the Japanese fishermen. Well, the maritime militia is basically a militarized force, where the Coast Guard, the Chinese Coast Guard, which is a military force in China, comes in and backs up that maritime militia, enforcing them out where they go into the Senkaku Islands. I go to the Chinese have a name for it, but the Japanese and American name is the Senkakus. China wants them. They're next on the hit parade after they get Taiwan, maybe before the short, sharp war, as they've called it, that they're going to conduct to get the Senkakus. Well, that's going to probably start out as a conflict involving the maritime militia or the so-called fishing fleets. It's going to be civilians from China going in initially, because Japan, the U.S., our mentality is, oh, you can't use military forces to block civilians who've occupied the Senkakus. Okay, so those are below the threshold of what the U.S. and Japan would think would require a military response. That's the gray zone operations. China knows, as Russia does, they work together. Push as far as you can to the red line that you can expect a military response. And then if you don't see any backbone in Washington, in the State Department, coming out of the White House, then you push beyond the red line and you keep pushing. That's the nature of the CCP. They will keep pushing those gray zone operations until they get so much more than they thought they could initially get away with.